1, 2, 3. Let's go, guys. Go.
It's soccer night in suburban Ottawa.
Wide.
This could be any subdivision in any city in Canada. Here, the election will be decided by a block of voters called the middle class. What is middle class?
I've been asking myself the same question. I think over the last few years, it's not as clear to me anymore. But what I'm interested in is how the politicians are always talking about it and talking about middle class and haven't figured out who it is.
Are you middle class?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Well, we have a decent salary coming into the house, probably more than decent. But at the same time, we're not independently wealthy.
Are you middle class?
Probably. Yeah, I'd say so.
You had to think about that.
Yes, I did.
How come?
It just seems hard. Everything's expensive. Buying a house was gut-wrenching because to try and figure out how much we could afford and how much the bank wanted to loan us a ton of money, but then it was, well, can we actually pay the payments if the interest rates ever go up and do the balancing act on that?
The middle class is defined so frequently just by economics, but I don't really think that it's so much economics. The middle class is a feeling. The middle class is how I feel about my life, my kids, the things I worry about.
The role and function of the family is like a micro social and economic unit. And politicians need to make sure that they support and recognize that unit. And by sort of grouping a whole bunch of them together and saying, you are the middle class, then that particular group can feel like somebody's paying attention to them. Somebody's aware of what they're going through, and therefore may be the one that they want to support.
Good ball, Mateo!
And I think the bottom line is that politicians want to target people who vote. And so people who are organized enough to have rewarding jobs, jobs that pay at least a certain level of income, and organized enough to get out here with their kids and do activities, or organized enough to get out and vote, would be middle class.
Canadians are looking for action. They're looking for help for the middle class.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're helping family, helping seniors, helping the middle class, and they can keep voting against them all they want.
The Prime Minister chose to spend more time with middle-class Canadians. He'd not only know who they were, he knew...
2/3 of Canadians live in suburbs. They are better educated and live in bigger homes than any class of wage earners in the country's history.
The urban legend that the middle class is in decline and collapse and so forth, it just isn't supported empirically at all. And I'm using StatsCan data after inflation, after tax.
The middle class never had it so good, on paper. Government research found Middle Canada spends only 12% of the family budget on food, less than a quarter on shelter, and most own their own home. There is money for restaurants and recreation, even games of chance.
So when people tell me how terrible things are today, I just laugh. I mean, I grew up on a farm in the 60s, and we had a single phone. And we had one black and white TV that was 12 inches. You know, I'm not trying to tell you hardship. We had a wonderful life on the farm. But, you know, the affluence today is mind-boggling.
If someone is focused on a group of people, somehow broadly defined in the middle, and say, so here is an issue with these people, and I'm going to do something about it. And the only way to catch someone's attention is to say, these are middle-class people, then it may be a really useful communication device.
Useful for politicians, then?
Useful for politicians.
In 2014, the New York Times celebrated Life in Canada, home of the world's most affluent middle class. They profiled a warehouse worker earning $24 an hour and children playing street hockey.
A recent New York Times analysis found that after-tax middle-class incomes in Canada now appear to be higher than in the United States. In fact, the Canadian middle class is among the richest in the developed world.
So it's a question of trying to figure out what people feel and then reflecting that in policies that will percuss those feelings, if I could press those buttons. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean, this is democracy. Isn't that what we're to do? Isn't that what politicians are to do?
I'm going to stay a little bit high level here and talk a little bit about the middle class and some of the claims that get made from time to time about the the state of the middle class here in Canada by the opposition members.
I would like to refer your attention to a recent study that was done by the Luxembourg Income Study database, which was reported in the New York Times, based on 35 years of surveys, which now claims that the Canadian middle class, notwithstanding what opposition parties in this House of Commons have said, have surpassed the median income for the middle class has surpassed that of the Americans, the United States.
Privately, in a memo marked secret, the Finance Department noted it wasn't that simple. The New York Times article did not take into account a few countries that have been traditionally ahead of both Canada and the United States, namely Luxembourg, Norway, and Switzerland.
The family right at the middle now earns just under $50,000. We can talk about that in hard statistics, but does that really capture your sense of what these people feel about the future, their need for security, their aspirations for their kids?
Someone making $12 an hour in manufacturing, those kinds of jobs, as I said, more or less have gone. There's an 89% drop in the number of jobs of such types. Even people who used to make $20 an hour 20 years ago, those kinds of jobs have diminished quite a lot. I would say about a third to 40% of those jobs are gone. So on the job and income front, people haven't done really well.
I'm not trying to tell you that people don't really believe this. They do. I mean, I talk to people who tell me this. I talk to my family members, and they say, oh, I'm broke, I'm broke. And you say, wait a minute, you've got 2 cars, you got a house, you just did 2 renovations, what are you talking about?
Well, they're in debt.
Well, sure. I mean, we all are.
Cabinet's Human Resources Department wondered what we know about the middle class in Canada. The conclusion, there is a slight hollowing out of the middle class. Since 1990, the proportion of middle-income Canadians has stagnated. The number decreased 2 percentage points since 1993.
But if you go back to traditional views of middle class, you knew exactly where you stood, and if you followed the rules, your life path was predictable. It's the precariousness of today's work environment. Your form or source of income is precarious. The likelihood of you having access to supplementary benefits and those kinds of supports that allow you to rise above where you are makes it really difficult for today's families.
2 parents, 2 kids, the stereotype of middle Canada, is not representative of the middle class anymore, government research showed. Since the 1990s, the family of 4 has lost ground. Couples with young children account for a decreasing proportion of middle-income families, barely 25%.
So what's happened? For the middle-income family in the late 1970s, that family with kids was making over $50,000. Now, 35 years later, after all these changes made in the name of higher prosperity, that family is making less than $50,000. They've not gained a bigger slice of the economic pie.
Up to an income level of about $70,000, start from 0 to 70. Those people who are earning those kinds of incomes, they haven't seen their incomes grow in 20 or 30 years. And people who are making incomes above $70,000 or so, their incomes have gone up quite a bit.
Senator Grant Mitchell of Edmonton is a former leader of the Alberta Liberal Party.
When I was knocking on doors, and you'd go to a middle-class area, and you would think that that would be a group that wouldn't necessarily vote with people who are rich, who vote conservative, I would argue. The poorest house, the most dilapidated house on that cul-de-sac or on that street would frequently have a Klein Progressive Conservative sign on it. And I could never figure that out until you start to think about that person in that house believes that they have a common set of concerns and a common set of interests with a whole bunch of other people that economists might define as the middle class, but that just, but they don't that house, the people in that house aren't economically middle class, but they see themselves as that because they have the same common concerns.
If they can say that my income is predictable, it's secure, it's stable, and I control what I spend, and I'm not relying heavily on credit, and I'm not heavily in debt, and what debt I do have I can service well, and that those investments that I'm making in myself and my family is going to allow us to have a better standard of living than we've had in the past or that my parents had, then they can say they qualify under this image of, or this title of, middle class in Canada.
On paper, Middle Canada is changing. Couples without young children are doing well, says this cabinet memo. Young families are not. Earnings are flat. Wages have stagnated. The government wrote, middle-income Canadians are unlikely to move to higher income brackets. The Canadian dream is a myth more than reality.
The rich are becoming richer, poor are becoming poorer, and the middle may be moving down and some actually moving up. So there's a hollowing of the middle in that sense.
What's happened? Those families have done everything they can. They've gotten more education. The women in those families have gone to work and worked harder. Fertility's been put off. The family size has shrunk. Families have done everything they can to adjust to a very turbulent economic climate. Some of them have managed just to stay afloat by running harder. And that's about 40% of the population.
Most people don't expect that they're going to get everything that they're asking for, or that they've told you that they think is important, but they want to know that there's somebody in this political process, a human being, a point of contact that's actually listening to them.